Alright, so this will be the first video in a series of videos explaining the Roman Catholic faith. It will be far deeper in scope than the basic rite of Christian initiation for adults. I decided to make this series because the quality of RCIA has declined. At one point, all priests were to be familiar with Thomas Aquinas' teachings so that the faithful could receive the fullest understanding of the faith from the angelic doctor of the Church himself. The Church has come to a position where RCIA is often taught by laymen, but many laymen are not prepared in understanding to convey the doctrine of the doctors of the Church, who have a unique authority within the Church. Therefore, this series will be an exposition of the Catholic faith above the basics, yet still not replacing the knowledge one finds by reading the doctors of the Church themselves. This RCIA series will be a distillation process that will leave a structured understanding of the Catholic faith for those who find themselves capable and willing to grasp the faith. Every 2 weeks there will be a new video. The order of videos will be as follows. First, we're going to prove that God and the soul exist according to Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and we'll talk a little bit about near-death experiences and some of the objections to Aristotle's proofs that God exists, including quantum mechanics and Hume's philosophy. In all of the videos, we'll be taking quotes from the Gospel and from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and in this video we'll be referencing Aquinas and Aristotle the most. Week 2, we'll talk about sin and morality, the nature of the act of sin, and the fall of Adam and Eve. The third video will be about church history, Old Testament prophecies, and sacrifice. This will show the remedy to sin throughout history and how God has related to man directly in Revelation. We'll refer to books like How Christ Said the First Mass, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Psalms, Daniel, Jeremiah, Exodus, Leviticus, and more. The fourth will be Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Here we'll talk about who and what Jesus is. Here we will talk about who and what Jesus is and how it is that we say he atoned for humanity. The fifth video will be on the Holy Trinity, the Holy Spirit, the gifts, and the results of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. The sixth video will be about virtues and predestination, referring to Augustine and Aquinas. The seventh video will be the problem of evil. Here we will solve the ancient problem of evil, contextualize it within predestination, and talk about how to deal with evil. In the eighth video, we'll talk about the sacraments of the Catholic Church. Here we will talk about confession, baptism, the Eucharist, and more. We'll show how these things aid against evil and strengthen the soul in this world, referring to Aquinas and the Catechism. The ninth video will be the Liturgy of the Catholic Church. This video will be dedicated to analyzing the font of worship created by Jesus and his apostles. We'll refer to the canon of the Latin Mass from the Catholic Church, How Christ Said the First Mass, and Aquinas. The 10th video will be on the levels of prayer and the progression of the spiritual life. Here we'll learn about Catholic mysticism, what prayer is, and to what end it is directed, referring to Teresa of Avila, Lagrange, St. John of the Cross, and Aquinas. The 11th video will be about Mary and the saints. This day will be dedicated to Mariology and the theology of the saints, how they interact with Catholic life, and we'll be looking at the Catholic dogmatic statements in historiographic books. 12th video will be on miracles, the gratuitous gifts, prophecies, the end of time, and the supernatural. Here we'll study what these are, and we'll look at the authoritative sources from the Catholic Church and see what they have to say about approved miracles. The 13th video will be on the 4 last things, that is death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And the 14th video will be a summary of what we've said, practical steps moving forward, and I will answer all of the questions from the comments. Before beginning, one person asked me by what authority I teach these things. The answer is that I have no authority of myself, but simply convey the teachings of the saints. And on the screen will be a list of the books I've completed and some that I've read, and I'll be drawing on knowledge from all of these books, and mainly from St. Thomas Aquinas, who's endorsed by the Church. The first video, this one, will be the most complex. It would be good if each person could comprehend one argument for why God exists, and one argument for why the soul is immaterial. We'll start with the 5 ways to prove God exists, then move on to what the soul is, how it is said to be immaterial and immortal, then finally we'll have a quick look at near-death experiences. The Catechism says that by natural reason man can know God exists with certainty, and this is according to the metaphysics of Aristotle, who logically reasoned to God existence without any divine revelation, as divine revelation was given to the Jews and reason to the Greeks, who came together under the Roman Empire, which Jesus entered into and glorified by the Catholic religion. So we can know that God exists by reason, but we cannot know that which is known only by revelation, like for example that God is a Trinity. Thus Jesus says, "Ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asks receives, and he that seeketh findeth. Jesus said, For judgment I have come into this world, that they which see not might see, and that they which see might be made blind. There are two ways that this verse is interpreted. First, that Jesus came to reveal the truth about evil and of sin, so that sinners may see and reform. And as a result, many who do not want to see close their eyes in order to reject what has been said, or they shut their eyes in ignorance, avoiding sight in the first place. There is another mystical interpretation. Those who at first do not believe in God nor in Christ are blind, but they come to a certain vision of God by faith, and this is the blind seeing. Natural reason is an aid in coming to believe in God's existence, but once a man assents to the reason and dogma of the Catholic faith, his faith begins to take on a mystical and supernatural dimension in the soul, where his soul's belief in God begins to develop less on logical and more on experiential and intuitive understanding. St. Thomas Aquinas himself is an extreme example of this, who after 30 years became the supreme doctor of the Church, one of the top 5 philosophers in history, and after an experience with God stated everything he ever wrote was like straw to him. Yet it is good that this experiential knowledge of God comes after the formation by reason. Otherwise, a man could fall into error. For this reason, we will lay a foundation describing the logic of the faith, looking at Aristotle and Aquinas. And if the viewer cannot understand all of it, that's to be expected, but if he understands even a part of it, then this will suffice as a first step. So firstly, why would God require faith to assent to the supernatural at all? Why not leave Christianity and belief in God as mere acquisition and assent to logic? Later, we'll address this question again, as to why man rejects God's existence at all. But for now, take these 3 points. First, there is always a way to deny reason, since by metaphysics a man can redefine what is reasonable. In modern times, this is done through epistemology. Second, faith makes God open to all, whereas logic is best understood by a few, but God rather make himself manifest in all people, not just those with the high intellect. Third, Aquinas says that truth need to be an object of faith so that man may have a truer knowledge of God. Aquinas says this because conclusions drawn from logic are understood proportionately to the underlying premises. However, God's essence is infinite and exceeding the conclusions of our logic. His nature transcends earthly reason. Therefore, faith is required to begin to comprehend God's essence more truthfully, as faith allows us to assent to supernatural concepts which lie above natural things. So we will see arguments from Aristotle that pose reasons to believe that God exists, yet those reasons are not equivalent to his nature, but are posterior analytics that describe features of God in his existence, but the reality of God is much more than this reason. Now, Aristotle's first way proves God's existence by motion. This typically is the easiest to understand, and within the 5 proofs for God, you really only need to understand 1 to say that you have a reasoned faith. Because this is the simplest and most straightforward, I'll cover the objections to this one also. Aquinas says, quote, It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Whatever is in motion is put into motion by another. For motion is nothing else than the change of something from potentiality to actuality. And for example, by this he means that a car that is stationary is in a state of potential to the actuality of motion by driving. He continues and says that nothing can be changed from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Thus, nothing can go from a state of potential, for example, being stationary and ready to drive, to actually driving, unless some other thing moves it that is itself already in motion. Aquinas says, it is not possible that the same thing can be at one time in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. So here he says in different respects because a car cannot be in the act of motion, driving down a road while also being stopped in respect to the same road. The car could, however, be in an act of motion, driving down the road, while being in a state of potency to stopping its motion. To put simply then, the first argument for God's existence is based on cause and effect in motion, that everything that is in a state of effect or motion has been put into motion by something before it. However, there must be a first event, because there can be no infinite series of cause and effect. If an infinite series of events could exist, the present motion would never exist. To understand this, we must understand what infinity is. Infinity is for there to always be one more. For instance, any defined large number is not infinity, because if the number were defined, it would be a finite or finished series. The etymology of infinite is literally taken as not finished. So in the case of any large number, there is not infinity, but infinity is in the potential to go on adding another event forever. So in math, it is written as 3 dots to show the potential of infinite continuation. As we stated before, we know that current motion is predicated on a past motion. If a series proceeded in an unfinished manner into the past, then the chain of causation to the current moment would never be completed, and consequently there would be no motion in the present. An infinite series of past events, then, is impossible to traverse. There is no way causality can persist infinitely back in time, because the present effects depend on prior causes, and the prior causes would never be defined, because they too would be depending on what is prior in motion, from them, and so on to infinity. Yet there is motion which we observe, and this rests on the principle of cause and effect. Therefore, a first and immovable mover must exist to start the series in motion. And we get a certain glimpse of motion being started by a first cause, insofar as we believe that humans have their own chain of causality. This will be explained in the second part, as man, in his intellect, has both understanding and will intuitively, and for this reason we say that man causes chains of events, because he has a choice over whether something should be or not be. Now, evidence from cosmology is also consistent with the Catholic dogma that the universe had a beginning and that there was a first motion. The Big Bang theory suggests that the universe began as a single point and then expanded. It was hypothesized by Lemaitre, a Jesuit priest and cosmologist, who first proposed that the universe emerged from a primeval atom in 1931. Scientist Hans Alfvén stated in disbelief, "I was there when Lemaitre first proposed his theory. There is no rational reason to doubt the universe existed indefinitely." He expressed his belief that the Big Bang was a myth devised to explain creation. He continued by stating he heard Lemaitre say in private that this theory was a way to reconcile science with Aquinas' theological dictum, creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing by a first and eternal mover. Yet this theory has proven to be not a myth, as all of the observational evidence science has gathered across 100 years is consistent with the predictions of the Big Bang theory. The three most important observations include the Hubble law, cosmic microwave background radiation, and the abundance of light elements. So what then are the objections to Aquinas' first way and Aristotle's proof that God exists by motion? Why does Hans Alfvén and many like him believe that there is no reason to doubt that the universe existed indefinitely when clearly, according to Aristotle's logic, it couldn't have? The simplest misunderstanding is when people don't understand what infinity is. They believe it can somehow be traversed, counted, or enumerated in any way, but infinity's definition is that it never is finished, always adding one to itself, and cause and effect act in this manner. What is in act motions what is in potential into act, and so on, infinitely back into time. The second objection is that there could be multiple movers acting as the first cause of the universe. This is solved simply. If there were multiple movers, then either one moves the others, and this is the original mover, which is God, or they all move at once, sharing the same attributes and essence, in which case they form a unity, one God. The third simple objection is that this argument doesn't prove that the Christian God exists, but the purpose of these arguments is to show it is reasonable to have faith that God exists writ large, and to demonstrate what characteristics are attributable to God. Now on to the complex objections to the first way to prove God. The most common response to the first cause argument is that people will say the first cause is a case of special pleading. So what is the definition of special pleading? Special pleading is defined as the creation of an arbitrary exception to a general or universal principle without justifying the special exception's reason. Obviously then, simply claiming special pleading is not an argument, but rather showing that an argument transgresses some universal principle forms the basis for the objection according to special pleading. So what is transgressed? The universal principle supposedly transgressed is that one's motion is caused by another's prior motion. Thus, if everything has motion from a cause prior, God must also have a cause. But this principle, cause and effect, applies only to those things which are in motion, which are physical, and God is entirely without motion, eternal, immaterial, and unchanging. Further, as stated, special pleading suggests that a universal principle is transgressed in the formulation of an argument. Yet the universal principle of cause and effect can only be true if it rests on a first mover, as shown previously. In this sense, God's existence is by no means an arbitrary exception, but a necessary prerequisite for causality and for universal principles to be formed in the first place. Thus, we see that God overcomes the principle of causality because he himself is a motionless being without potentiality, but instead is a being in pure act, divine essence, subsisting in himself. We have only imperfect examples to compare God to as a being in act in this life. For instance, the human intellect is always existing in its act of being, but this example isn't fitting of God because the intellect changes. The intellect knows less at one time and knows more at another. The form of a circle is unchanging and immaterial, but it is not independent substance. But instead, the form subsists in a man's intellect, but God subsists in himself, so this isn't a great example either. God's act as the immutable first mover is confirmed also in sacred scripture by divine revelation thousands of years before Aristotle. So Exodus reads, God said unto Moses, I am that I am. Likewise, Jesus, the incarnation of God, states, Truly, truly I tell you, before Abraham I am. In Psalm 19 says, The heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament show forth his work. In Genesis 1 says, In the beginning God created. In Malachi 3:6 says, I am the Lord, I change not. In Revelation 1:8 says, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Now unto the fifth and the strongest argument against Aristotle, which comes from modernist philosophy, especially Hume, who dissociates the principle of cause and effect from physical reality, suggesting causality is primarily a psychological construct. In Hume's opinion, whatever appears to the senses as essentially ordered is really just the intellect drawing order and superimposing it on top of physical reality. He denies that there is any intrinsic order within human reality at all. So if you were to take two events, A and B, and you observed that B follows after A every time, and say that this means a necessity exists, then in Hume's philosophy all that has happened is that you made a psychological connection, an association. An example would be if a man dropped a ball, and the ball fell each time. The psychological association is that dropping the ball causes its falling. But without any knowledge of gravity, if you traveled to a part of space with zero gravity and tried the same, your understanding would break down. For this reason, Hume says we are not justified in believing any speculative inference about reality due to the principle of cause and effect. Subsequently, the best way to oppose Aristotle's logic for God's existence is not by attacking his logic, but by denying the certainty of the universal principle of cause and effect, and this is ordered towards the end of doubt. It would seem then that the Catechism erred when it said that man can know God exists by reason alone. But the Catechism makes this statement according to Aristotle's understanding of cause and effect, which is the reasonable interpretation of causality based on the works that we see in nature. There are two responses to Hume, one according to Catholicism and one according to Aristotelian logic. First, the Catholic response. In essence, Hume supervenes the entire logic of Aristotle, bypassing it. Obviously, this is a problem because the logic is still evident. Nevertheless, Hume calls the premise for logic itself non sequitur, made irrelevant because it is a perception of man. Now, it would seem that this belief system is completely absurd, being adhered to by virtually nobody in practicality. Yet this is not so. Many uphold this worldview primarily to give license to evil, circumventing objective morality claims. For instance, this philosophy would be useful for many sins like murder, since one could claim that it is merely a human perception that man A is said to be the cause of death for the murdered man B. Since the causation of A on B is just a matter of particle motion, and any perceived truth about the reality of causation is merely speculation. So we see this used to justify crime, and many philosophers of our day question whether criminals should be punished at all. In less extreme cases, this ideology is useful for living godlessly. Hedonism strives on it because an air of legitimacy is given to the notion that we just can't know anything at all. At the point in the argument where a man has given up on causality, the Catholic response is to supervene upon Hume's supervention of logic by stating that the Catholic faith is above logic and doubt. It is supernaturally infused into a man by God himself, and it is this supernatural intuitive knowledge that leads someone to God. It is non-physical and need not be caused by a series of underlying events, as in the case of St. Paul, who received a vision of God and instantly believed. Hence, Jesus says, No man can come to me except the Father which has sent him draw him in, and I will raise him up on the last day. And he says, Ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you. In Romans reads, "Those God foreknew he also predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters." In a certain sense, Hume's philosophy is self-defeating because it does away with the principle that underlies all science. Nevertheless, to deal with Hume according to Aristotle, Aristotle's logical proof for God existing is only certain proof according to one's assent to belief in the underlying principles. The level of certainty we have that God exists is proportionate to the certainty of the principles by which we demonstrate the necessity of the first cause. And the principle of cause and effect is as certain as it gets, being observed in virtually everything by everybody, yet still possible to object to. To finish then, let us consider why God gave us a near certain degree of logic regarding his existence. God could have given us an intuitive intellectual vision of himself, similar to how man's intellect immediately comprehends himself, yet God did not do this, and this reality will be better understood after studying the problem of evil. 2. God could have made it so that an intuitive intellectual vision of him was possible to grasp based on the things around us, yet God did not give us an intuitive vision as mentioned above, nor did he give us this possibility of an intuitive vision. That we certainly cannot have an intuitive vision of God's essence, St. Thomas Aquinas makes clear, as he points out that the way we arrive at knowledge of God is by studying things less than him, and therefore we cannot come to an intuitive understanding of God's essence by worldly sense, because the five senses depend on sensible objects around us, all of which are less than God. That leaves us with three options. 1. God could have given us zero logical proof of his existence, but because God loves us, he did not do this. 2. God could have given us undeniable logic, and as we see from Hume, logic is deniable. And 3. God could have given us deniable but probable logic, and this is proper to our state in life. So why doesn't God make his existence known to logic beyond any doubt whatsoever? It's clear to anyone who studies and believes in cause and effect that God's existence is necessary, and thus is undeniable to those who search according to reason. Hence Jesus says, "Seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened." Further, undeniable logic is not even possible according to Hume's perspective. Thus, Hume's philosophy is malicious. It requires a corruption of the will to hold, because it abolishes truth, and this is contrary to reality. In relation to Jesus' words, holding Hume's philosophy would be the equivalent to not seeking, as there is nothing to seek, in this worldview. Nevertheless, God leaves this gap of plausible deniability to the malicious in part to bring about his plan to manifest justice in relation to evil, and to cause greater good from evil, and to require faith. Since in this life, doubt is overcome by faith. Faith is required to believe in God, and it is by faith that eternal life begins in us, because by faith a man moves towards the unknown and supreme end of God. In lieu of an intuitive grasp of God's essence, or of certain logic, faith guided by reason allows man's will to assent and proceed to something which is above every sensible thing we could understand. Through faith the will assents to love unseen truths, which faith understands better than reason, because reason is limited by inputs inferior to God. Further, if movement of the will proceeding on to God was entirely dependent on reason, few men would ever gain a relationship with God due to lack of intelligence or busyness or laziness. What's more, pursuit of God by logical inquiry alone takes too much time, to the detriment of the young, the old, the sick, and dying. A popular modern rejection to Aristotle's argument is to deny the nature of cause and effect through quantum theory. In my experience, I lived with a 75-year-old nuclear scientist, Bob, for 6 months, who argued against Aristotle according to quantum mechanics. Some say that quantum fluctuations themselves could have caused the universe, yet all these arguments presuppose space existing and do not overcome Aquinas' second demonstration for God's existence. The better argument from quantum mechanics attempts to dissociate our understanding of the principle of cause and effect, suggesting that quantum mechanics are proof against Aristotle's physics. This refers to the observation that a particle's position may at one moment be in one position and then be in another, one of multiple potential positions, without a clear mechanism to cause this. Debating from this perspective, Bob used the example of a cloud moving through the wind. The particles of the cloud have a series of potential positions, and then are actualized in these new positions according to a probabilistic distribution. Thus, if you were able to map out the edges of the cloud, They would be changing at every moment according to the motion of each particle. What location each particle is actualized in appears to occur randomly within a set of probabilities. About quantum motion, Feynman questions, quote, "How does it work? What is the machinery behind the law? No one has found out any machinery behind this law. No one can explain any more than we have just explained. No one will give you any deeper representation of the situation. We have no ideas about a more basic mechanism from which these results can be deduced." Therefore, if the wind were to move the particles in cloud A to the position of cloud B, we wouldn't know whether the particles would end up in position 1, 2, or 3 for each particle. To explain this phenomena and how it relates to cause and effect, say that the wind moves a cloud with particles in position A into position B, and we know that the particles will end up in B1, B2, or B3. Then A can't be said to be the cause of the motion properly speaking, yet the wind is said to cause the particle to actualize in new positions which are probabilistic. Which location the particle ends up in is seemingly random, therefore the nature of the cause is uncertain. Yet on a larger scale, the evolution of systems is entirely deterministic. It's the outcome of particle measurements on a smaller scale that's probabilistic. Now, Professor Marsh at University of Illinois states that viewing quantum mechanics and Newtonian mechanics as separated leads to cognitive dissonance, and this is because an elementary particle is localized through prior interactions and it obeys all relevant conservation rules. So what specifically is the attack on Aristotle's argument for God? If an effect is not derived from some prior cause acting on it, but from chance particle interactions, then an infinite regress is possible because any current event would not be dependent on prior ones, but every event would be a chance occurrence, one after another, and the order in it would just be an observation of chance. In other words, some people observe what appears to be random in quantum motion and extrapolate that all motion may be random. Yet this isn't a valid objection because we see that particles uphold conservation of energy perfectly, as Professor Marsh says, in quantum mechanics. Particles receive energy for motion from prior interactions, and in this sense the causal chain of motion is not broken. We say effects are determined by their causes, and even particles depend on prior motions to receive energy for locomotion. We know that these prior interactions create a probabilistic distribution of a particle's final location, which falls in a pattern that upkeeps Newton's description of motion. Therefore, the law of cause and effect holds, and so does the argument from motion. So while the motion of particles is dependent on the motion of prior interactions, what we do not know is the efficient cause, that is, the nature of the act which localizes a particle in its final position. A final position which is one of many contingent positions, dependent on the particle's initial state. To quote Feynman on the efficient cause, "No one has found any machinery behind this law. No one will give you any deeper representation." The continual search for more and more fundamental forces eventually finds itself resting upon something actual, that is, something in act, the cause of force itself, and this is God. Hence Aquinas says, God is the cause of being itself, as we will show in argument 2. Hence Jesus said, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground without the Father's will? Even the very hairs on your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, ye are of more value than the sparrows." It follows that God's will must be concerned with that which he is the cause of. Therefore, whatever exists, no matter in what way it exists, is subject to his order. In the remote sense, God is the cause of anything that exists because he causes being. In the proximate sense, God is the direct cause of anything without a prior cause. Therefore, God is the proximate cause of the most fundamental force that causes quantum motion. Now we'll quickly go through the other 4 arguments for God from Thomas Aquinas. This was the argument that was always the most intuitive and obvious to me. The second argument for God's existence is by efficient cause, and the efficient cause gives form to a material being. Nothing in nature is found to be the cause of its own nature, since then a being would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Efficient causes cannot go on to infinity because the first being causes an intermediate being which causes a chain ending in the present being. Therefore, if there is no first efficient cause among beings to give form to the next being, there could be no present being. To point out the difference between the first and the second way to prove God's existence. The first way was to prove God's existence from motion, that is, what moved first. The second way is to prove God's existence from the question, how did the first thing gain its form? One can make sense of this by looking at the chain of human life. If there were infinite human parents back in time, then there would be no first parents. And if there were no first parents to give DNA to the second generation, then there would be no third generation to inherit DNA, and so on down the chain, meaning there would be no present beings. Further, the first two humans could not have been their own cause, since causes are prior to effects. Therefore, there had to be a first cause in the chain. Note that if somebody wanted to throw the evolutionary chain in before the chain of human life, it makes no difference as to where form comes from. Therefore, there had to be one first cause capable of giving the first beings in the chain their form, and this is God. Now onto the third way, and perhaps the least intuitive. In nature, we find things that are possible to be and not to be, since things of nature are found to be generated and corrupted. But given a long enough time, an infinite time, it is impossible for something to perpetually exist, which has the potential to not exist. All physical created things have the potential not to exist, even our own universe. Therefore, if everything is in potential to non-existence, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. If that were true even now, there would be nothing in existence today, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. Therefore, not all existence is merely possible, but there must exist something that is necessary. Hence, we postulate the existence of some being which has in itself its own necessity, and this is God. Now onto the fourth way. Aquinas points out that most men say evil exists and therefore they do not believe in God. But really, because evil exists, man should believe in God. This is because of the gradation found in the goodness of things. In any set of beings or things where a quality is compared, there are some good and some worse. One of them the best. To say something is better than another is to compare it to whatever is maximally good. Thus, something is most beautiful, most true, and most complete, and so on. A being's degree of goodness is defined as its relationship to a maximally good being, which causally defines its being as more or less perfect. This being contains every perfection maximally, and this we call God. Now onto the fifth and final proof of God. The final proof for God is regarding teleology, that things naturally act towards ends. And where do the ends of nature come from? Whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this we call God. The fifth way is a question about order and where it comes from. In daily life, we see that those beings and act, which have intellect and will, are the ones that create order within things. Thus we call God the principle that has ordered the simplest natural things to have modes of being which are intrinsic to them. As the heart knows to pump blood, the plant photosynthesizes, atoms maintain their state, and iron is magnetic. Now onto the soul. First, what does modern science say about the soul and its powers like sight and understanding? In truth, modern science knows very little about these because we cannot observe and experiment on immaterial principles like the intellect and sight. Modern science, having essentially nothing to add, calls the intellect an emergent property, which are defined as those properties that are not evident in the individual components of a system, but show up when combining those components, so they might be called surprises. New York University is home to one of the world's top 50 neuroscientists, and his name is Georgi Buzaki. So it's been stated that we essentially know nothing more about the intellect than Aristotle did 2,300 years ago. Buzaki makes a number of references to Aristotle, and so he caught my eye, and I will use him as my primary neuroscience reference. Let us begin with a quick look at what form and matter are. The form of something is its intelligible structure. Form gives things their species. Man-made forms derive from his intellect, whereas nature's forms derive from God. When a form is created in matter, a composite is made. So what are some examples? The form of a circle everyone can consider in his mind. Its definition is a round figure with continuous points equal distance from the center. Thus, there is the form of a circle, which is an intelligible object in the mind. If this form were to be put into Play-Doh to make a dough circle, then a composite is born. Before there was just Play-Doh, then mixed with the form, the Play-Doh circle was created. Another example is art. The artist Leonardo da Vinci possesses the form of the Mona Lisa in his mind, and once made in the materials the Mona Lisa is created. Hence the formal cause of the Mona Lisa comes into being simultaneously as the artist imbues its form into the art materials. So, what is a man? Well, we say a man is alive, don't we? But what is alive? The definition of alive is for a being to naturally move itself. Things that aren't alive are moved by forces exterior to themselves, like a rock. So what moves a man? The principle of a man's motion is his soul. This is why the Greek word for soul is anima, from which we get the word animate. The soul animates the body. If the body wasn't animated, we would call it a corpse. Therefore, there is a principle of life, which we call the soul, within a body that makes it different from the corpse. That principle of life isn't the composite, the body that has life, nor is it the matter, the body underlying life. What is left then is that the soul is the form of the body. Man is a composite then, where the body is matter and the soul is its form or intelligible structure. The soul and the body make a composite, as wax in the impression sealed on it creates some particular wax seal. The soul is given at the moment of conception and causes motion in the body. If organic matter didn't have any soul impressed upon it, no man would come to be. Just as the Play-Doh circle could not come to be if the Play-Doh didn't have the circle impressed upon it. Now we'll quickly go over the vegetative soul and the sensitive soul. First, the vegetative soul. We've deduced that the soul is the form of the body, and it's given at conception, since at conception a unity is formed called a zygote, and this is a combination of form and matter. There are three parts of the soul, vegetative, sensitive, and intellectual, each with its own powers. The power of the vegetative soul is for nourishment, growth, and reproduction, and so on. One can prove the existence of the vegetative soul by proceeding backwards in the process of cause and effect to identify the first cause of the body. So, let's say you have a zygote. The scientists say growth is caused by the genetic information in its unique DNA. What causes the DNA to actualize growth into more cells? It would be said that some molecules and proteins cause this, and so what causes those to move? Atoms and forces. And so what causes the organizational structure of those forces into a growing zygote? Eventually we get to an organizing principle which directs and individuates the motion of the body, even the body of a zygote, towards its end. This principle of motion is called the soul, specifically the vegetative soul, which all forms of life have, even plants. Of the vegetative soul in physical beings, Aristotle says, it is possible for this power to be separate from the others, whereas the others to be separate from it is impossible, at least in mortal beings. This is evident in plants, for there is in them no other power of the soul. To live by this principle, then, is common to all living things. Now onto the sensitive soul. The sensitive soul is the formal cause that actualizes physical phenomena such as touch in the light hitting the retina into sense data that is called phantasms of feeling and sight respectively. Aristotle says that sensation operates like somebody uttering and another person understanding. Sensation occurs when a bodily sense organ is acted upon by an exterior force. Therefore, senses are not in act, but in potency. They retain the potential to be acted upon by something external, which actualizes the sense. For instance, the eye in darkness remains in potency to light, and when light hits the retina, the sense of sight is actualized. So which beings have a sensitive soul? Of the senses, touch, smell, taste, hearing, and sight, all animals have touch. Some more have smell, taste, and hearing, and the highest sense is sight, by which a proper image of the world is given. This sensitive soul applies to all animals, even those that stay in one place. In all animals, the most base sense is that of touch. Plants and animals have vegetative souls, but sensitive souls are proper to and give sensitive life to animals. Even those like sea urchins and clams have a sensitive soul, feeling by the sense of touch. One can see why a tree doesn't have a sensitive soul then, because if you touch a tree with a hot stick, it wouldn't respond, nor if you impaled it or otherwise. So how does the sensitive soul work? That is by ratio. Each part of the sensitive soul has a power which acts through a bodily organ, as the power of sight acts through the eye. The senses are a certain ratio that are active when there is an alteration in them. If this motion is too strong for the sense, the ratio is lost. For instance, excessive light or darkness destroys the sight's ability to detect a ratio in the exterior object. Thus, looking into the sun can blind you. Another principle of the sensitive soul is that where sense is, appetite is, and appetite directs to an end. As we've seen, the senses work by ratio. After sensing a pleasant or painful object, the soul pursues or avoids it, as though affirming or denying. For instance, if you feel something burning hot, the ratio is thrown off and the sense of touch makes a snap judgment, denying it in favor of what is cold. This snap judgment is the appetitive power or the appetite, which accompanies sense. Likewise, if you taste something good, the appetite will naturally affirm it and pursue more of it. To act by appetites alone is proper to animals, but humans judge the goodness of something not just in relation to their sense, but also in relation to their intellectual judgment. Before touching on the intellect, it's also important to know that our senses operate properly. Each particular sense can discern its sense object and not be deceived. Thus, sight does not err in relation to its object. For instance, in regard to sight, nobody looks at a cat and sees a shark. If the sight is said to err, it is for one of the following reasons. 1. Something is wrong with the eye, like a cataract. 2. The object seen is obstructed, either too far away, too close, darkness or brightness. 3. The object passes too quickly to be clear. 4. The memory of the phantasm fades. Or 5. The association in the intellect is wrong due to misunderstanding. Therefore, in a healthy eye, the power of sight does not err, but the circumstances are such that error may arise by failed apprehension, recollection, or understanding. Lastly, there is also the common sense. We need this common sense not only to sense that we sense, but to maintain normative states in the senses and to distinguish between sense objects in their proper sense. So if you had something that was both sweet and white, one single power must say that they differ. For example, sweet from the white. Therefore, it is one single power that asserts this, the common sense. Common sense categorizes something that appeals to multiple senses into their respective sense category. For example, the white and bitter thing. The common sense recognizes whiteness as a matter of sight and bitterness as a matter of taste. So we've seen what the vegetative soul does. It has the power for reproduction, growth, nourishment, and so on. And the sensitive soul puts into act sight from the eye, the feeling of touch, the sensation of taste, and so on. But what the intellect does in act is that it understands. Now we'll move on to the intellectual soul, the most important part of the soul, the part which we were made for and which sets us apart from other animals. Busaki states that the intellect has an ability to know itself, and to differentiate itself automatically. By nature, it grasps separable forms from phantasms which come to it through the senses. The intellect grasps forms of things and then creates universal objects, which are a sort of collation between things, and then it judges. This is the part that is in act itself. It's immaterial, not mixed with a bodily organ, and it's immortal. By nature, the intellect grasps separable forms from phantasms. So, in our diagram, Aristotle looking at a Plato circle, the power of sight receives a phantasm of the Plato circle, and then the agent intellect extracts the form of circle from the Plato circle. By nature, the intellect grasps separable forms from phantasms, and our diagram will help to understand this. Phantasms are the result of senses in act, which come into act through the sense-sensing matter. For example, a phantasm of sight would be when the light reflecting off an object hits the eye, creating the immaterial experience of sight. The intellect in act is impassible, meaning it does not suffer physical passions compared to the sense of touch, which is impassioned when in contact with a hot thing, for example. The intellect is always in act, knowing what it knows. At minimum, the intellect is an act which consists of understanding itself. While an eye must have light hitting it for the potential of vision to be actualized, the intellect is always in act. The reason we call the intellect rational is because it follows reason. The intellect understands itself, then it understands the world, and the intellect reasons about what is good for it, then is obedient to this deliberation. Now, to touch on the potential intellect. There is a part of the intellect that does have potency. We call this the potential intellect. It is the part which remains in potency, always prepared to receive new phantasms from the lower senses. Thus, Aristotle says, "The intellect is like a tablet on which there is nothing actually written, waiting to receive intelligible objects." To clarify Aristotle's words, the intellect in act begins as a blank tablet when you are young and know nothing. It becomes filled in understanding of intelligible objects you understand by experience. The potential intellect is always a blank tablet, which is temporarily filled by phantasms. Whereas the intellect in its act of understanding begins as a blank tablet and becomes filled over time, the potential intellect is always a blank tablet, which is temporarily filled by phantasms. Busacki affirms this understanding. He says that the difference structurally between the brain of a baby, which has zero information, and a man's brain is nearly nothing. He continues and says that the only difference between them is what information they received and processed. Now we'll talk about the agent intellect. The intellect in its act of agency comprehends these phantasms by its own intuitive power. The agent intellect extracts the forms it understands from phantasms. The agent intellect in act makes forms intelligible to itself. Busacki recognizes the intellect in act as a problem for science. This explains why AI can't become sentient. He says, quote, "This is the problem, how to actuate. Information is made known to the brain, then information becomes actual from the point of view of the observer. In other words, material reality is synthesized into an immaterial reality intuitively understood by the intellect." Aristotle says that the agent intellect may sometimes understand something and sometimes not, meaning when a phantasm is posed, like the various sights a man might see while looking out the window on a train, the agent intellect can extract from those phantasms or let them pass. To continue on the agent intellect, the intellect understands things instantly that are indivisible, like a circle. But the agent intellect can also make compositions by adding and subtracting things. This is where falsehood and truth arise. For instance, the intellect's universal understanding of a man compared to a human presented to the sight. The senses are always true about what is shown, as we've explained, but the intellect may compose rightly or wrongly. For instance, if what is seen is a woman, the woman will be present to the sight, but the mind may judge the woman as a man according to his own universal conception of a man. One final analog to help understand, art is a genus, that is, a universal conception of the underlying artworks that make up the term, quote, art. There are materials that are used for art and artists who make art. The agent intellect, then, is the artist who makes artworks of understanding from phantasms in the potential intellect. The materials for art can become anything, just as the potential intellect can have any phantasm in it. However, there is one incongruency with the analog above. That is that the intellect becomes the thing. As it extracts the circle from the phantasm, it actually becomes the circle. But Da Vinci did not become the Mona Lisa. Therefore, the intellect is not exactly like the artist. Therefore, the agent intellect is an act which has the power to make other things like itself immaterial. Hence, the intellect is closer to the concept of art than it is the artist. Now, onto the appetite of the practical intellect. Just as senses have appetites, the intellect also has an appetite. As we said, the bodily senses will judge something as good or bad immediately, as when touch feels fire and judges it as bad because the mean of the ratio is set off. Phantasms are the sense objects presented to the intellect. A phantasm of sight depicting a beautiful woman is judged as good when the intellect affirms it according to its understanding of the beautiful. The beautiful itself is a universal conception. Thus, the practical intellect judges phantasms as good or bad and pursues or avoids. Hence, the intellect never operates without a phantasm presented to it. Therefore, the will of man seeks what is good according to the appetite of the sense and or what the practical intellect desires. When a man moves in accord with his intellect, he is being reasonable. But if the appetite of the sense is incongruent with his reason, he acts for his senses against his better judgment. Now onto imagination. Imagination is different than both sensing and understanding, but it is triggered by sensation and it's used in forming opinions. The imagination provides phantasms that aid in deciding what to pursue. For instance, when one's sense of hunger triggers him and causes an image of a burger and a salad, and so he pursues the image more fitting to the judgment of his intellect. If the man has a universal perception of health in which he wants to pursue, he'll pursue the salad. It is said that only man has reason because he alone judges according to universal understanding of what is good, rather than to react to the lower senses alone. Men reject their understanding and rely on imaginings, especially due to vices, mental illness, or lack of sleep. The result of rejecting reason is that men follow their imaginary phantasms as if they were true. Lastly, we'll talk about what memory and recollection are. St. Thomas, commenting on Aristotle's On Memory and Recollection, states that remembrance is an act performed through a bodily organ. Memory is not of the present, but sense is. Memory exists with the image phantasm, hence memory exists only in those things that have senses. Therefore, memory exists also in other animals and not just in man. Recollection is also something bodily. It's an effort and inquiry to find data from memory. However, recollection is not the simple recovery of a memory, nor is it the original acquisition of a memory, which is sensing. Nor is recollection the absolute relearning or repeated discovery of something. Rather, recollection is a power of the intellect in which someone recovers what he has already known or sensed before. There must be something to be a starting point of recollecting. Therefore, you can see that the intellectual power of recollection is directed towards that which was sensed or known before, but which is not remembered fully, and Aristotle calls it something like a search. Okay, now we're going to look at whether the intellect is immaterial or material. The neuroscientist Busacki states, "We know that there is stimulus that comes into the brain and then output, but there is something in the middle which is very difficult to research." He continues by stating, neurons do not have a perception of what is on the outside. Put another way, Busacki is stating that the electrons moving across the brain is not equivalent to sight, nor is there any mechanism that we know of that makes light hitting the retina actualize into the conscious perception and experience of sight. The act of consciousness, the intellect, or the thing in the middle, as Busacki says, confounds science precisely because it is immaterial and cannot be tested nor apprehended by science per se, but only by looking at its effects. Aristotle makes logical arguments proving why the intellect is immaterial. If Aristotle is right about the underlying problem, which we will see that he is, then there is no hope for science to understand the intellect and act. Therefore, science has relegated the intellect as an emergent property, which requires further research. Yet, we all know that the brain plays an important role in the body, so how do we make sense of this relationship? Busacki describes the brain as such, quote, "The brain doesn't serve anything but to coordinate the activity of the body. The brain's primary function is serving the body information, but the brain maintains its own dynamic. It has no purpose but to maintain everything in the body." The brain's role then is to amalgamate sensory data, to summarize it, and to provide signals back to the body. Busacki states that the brain can do this in unknown ways. These are the signals that are intertwined with the senses, and as we know, the intellect is dependent on the lower senses for phantasms, which are the basis of understanding and cognition. Alzheimer's helps to explain this relationship. The man with Alzheimer's has dead or damaged neurons, so the brain can no longer serve its role in coordinating the senses. As a result, the intellect fails to receive phantasms, which arrive from the lower senses. The brain also fails to deliver proper outputs of the intellect to the lower senses. Though the intellect remains immaterial and inact, its ability to operate is inhibited because there is no phantasms for it to operate as a result of. At the beginning of his inquiry into the soul, Aristotle states that if it can be proven that any part of the soul is separated from the body and has its act of being in itself, then this will go on living after death. That is to say, if the intellect's operation is equal to its being, and it doesn't require a bodily organ to do this, then it will go on living forever. But the intellectual soul defines and actualizes itself. The intellect's act is to understand, and it is what it knows. So long as the intellect is separated from matter, this being will live forever, because its operation subsists in itself. The important part of the inquiry is to understand that the intellect's form is its act, because this makes it self-subsisting. To clarify this, take a car. When the materials of a car are put into the form of a car, it has its being, yet it remains in a state of potential to its act of motion, driving. To enter into its act of driving, it requires a driver to drive it. Thus, its form of being and its act are two different things. Compare this to the intellect. While the car's act of driving comes into being from a driver operating it, the intellect's act of understanding is intuitive. Its understanding is its very form of being. The form of the intellect is what it knows. Its act is to understand, and what is understood is known. Therefore, the intellect subsists on itself, acting and being the same thing. The question, therefore, is whether the intellect's act of being depends on a bodily organ. Science seems to have no answer other than to call the intellect an emergent property. But what is it that made Aristotle confident that the intellect is separated from a bodily organ and immaterial, a being that is self-subsistent? Let us look at a few of the arguments for the immateriality of the intellect. First, the comprehension of universals. If the intellect was physical, it would only comprehend the forms of composites as seen in nature. But instead, it understands universals. So for example, instead of understanding a Chevrolet, a Ford, and a Tesla as they actually are in reality, man also forms the universal conception of car, even though car does not exist in reality, only the Ford and the Tesla do. Therefore, the intellect is creating something immaterial. Physical bodies gain form according to some existing form being given to them. For instance, Plato receives a circle. The intellect, however, apprehends universals, which do not exist in physical reality. Next, onto the immateriality of phantasms and the immaterial abstractions that we make. Every being is made from form and matter, and this creates composites. The forms of composites are abstracted as immaterial objects from phantasms and then understood. For instance, the form of a circle is extracted from the Plato circle. Thus, the information becomes actual from the point of view of the understanding. Therefore, the intellect must also be without matter, since the phantasm of sight is not the thing seen itself, and the form understood from the phantasm is also not the matter of the things seen. Now onto the third argument. Every being acts in congruence with its form, because the form is the principle of action in everything. The Plato circle has its act of being by the form of circle being impressed on it. If you were to remove the circle from the Plato circle, then the principle of action would be removed from it, and its act of being, as a Plato circle, would be destroyed. The brain has its act of being when it comes to exist in organic matter, firing neurons. If, therefore, the intellect's form was that of a body's, its action would be in keeping with its form, and it would not transcend the order of bodies with its action of understanding. Every being's act of existence is in keeping with its form, and the intellect's act is to understand universals, forms, and itself. Therefore, the intellect must be immaterial. Next, onto the fourth argument, understanding another does not corrupt the former. No body can receive the substantial form of another body, unless it loses its own form by corruption. For instance, a Plato circle cannot become a Plato square until it loses its circleness. Yet, the intellect apprehends forms by constant addition, as if to apprehend one species of animal, then another and another. It gains understanding without any corruption, unlike bodies. The fifth argument is forms of contraries. Forms of contraries in matter destroy one another, as the Plato circle would be destroyed if it became a Plato square. But within the intellect, contraries exist and serve as ratios for one another, as the intellect grasps the concept of fire and ice in regard to each other. Consequently, they do not have material being in the intellect. The sixth argument for the immateriality of the intellect is comprehending things as better than they are. forms of things are understood as more perfect in being than they really are in the bodies which they exist in. For instance, if a man looks at an oatmeal cookie, he comprehends that it's round in a circle, even though that's not the reality. If the intellect were merely the implantation of data onto the brain, then things would be understood as they are in reality. Yet our intellect apprehends objects according to the mode they exist in our understanding, which is more perfect than reality. The next argument is containment of other intellects. It is impossible for two bodies to contain each other like two rocks being inside each other. Yet two intellects can apprehend one another when one understands the other, thus the intellect is immaterial. Now, the intellect in relation to infinity. If the intellect is a body, it is infinite or finite. A body cannot be infinite, therefore it would have to be finite. Yet the act of understanding can extend to infinite things. If the intellect were a finite body, one would expect, after reaching a certain understanding, the understanding of lesser things would corrupt. But this is not the case. The intellect actually accrues with more understanding, and therefore the intellect is not a body. Now onto numerical containment. All things contained in another are contained according to a numerical way, as the large bin contains 4 things of a quarter of its size within it. But the intellect has no limit to the forms apprehended by it, nor to the memory. Why then are memories forgotten or not remembered? Due to a lack of utility, failing to use the memory. Now onto a quick proof of the immateriality of the intellect, the agent moving it. No body comprehends the agent moving it, but the intellect does comprehend the agent itself. And lastly, the intellect lacks all nature. As we explained before, the intellect is like a blank tablet. And so, since the intellect is capable of understanding all bodily things, it must lack every bodily nature as sight lacks color. If the intellect had any determinate physical nature, it would be prevented from knowing certain other natures. Now, the third last thing that we'll cover is the immortality of the intellect. So we've seen first that the intellect's act is the same as its being, and that the intellect is immaterial. It is a foregone conclusion then that the intellect is immortal because it was created by the first and eternal cause. The first argument for the immortality of the intellect is from God. Not being material, nor having body and matter, nor even existing as a composite, the intellect is its own form, created by God, subsisting in his act of being. Therefore, the intellectual soul is entirely incorruptible. Argument 2. It is possible for a natural instinct to be in vain, for if God created us with the desire to live eternally, but thwarted the desire, he would not be good. But God's will is perfectly good, and therefore the soul is immortal. Argument 3. The forms of things are understood as intelligible because they are immaterial, universal, and consequently incorruptible. Substances that are themselves forms can never lose being. For instance, the form of a circle has being in a man's mind, and it could never not be round nor continuous. But the intellect is subsistent form itself. It cannot possibly cease to exist. In the same way that a form subsists in the intellect, the form of man's intellect subsists in God eternally. Argument 4. From corruption. First, no form is corrupted except either by the action of contrary, as the form of health is destroyed by the form of sickness. 2. Things are corrupted by the corruption of the subject, as the form of the Play-Doh circle is destroyed by a solvent which dissolves the Play-Doh. Or 3. A thing is destroyed by the failing of its cause. First, there is no act contrary to the intellect. Second, there is no underlying body of the intellect to be corrupted. And third, the cause of the intellect is eternal. Argument 5. If the soul was corrupted through the corruption of the body, it follows that it would be weakened through the body weakening. Yet if the organ be repaired, sense operates as always. Hence Aristotle pontificates, if an old man were able to get a young eye, he would certainly see as well as a young man. And through modern science, Aristotle was proven correct. A cornea transplant restores the physical eye to health, and the underlying act of sight is the same as it always was. In the same sense, the interior voice never ages or declines, despite the body failing. Argument 6. When a thing is corrupted, potency remains. As a thing is not corrupted into non-being, prime matter always exists. Thus, if the Play-Doh circle was destroyed, the Play-Doh would remain in another shape. On the contrary, the intellect's form is its act of being. Therefore, if the intellect was corrupted somehow, it would remain after the corruption, which is impossible. Argument 7. All corruption consists in separation of form from matter, as the Plato circle is corrupt when the circle is removed from the being. Yet the intellect has no material, therefore it is not corrupted. Aristotle says that without the corruptible part of our soul, that is, the sensitive and vegetative elements, the intellect comes to understand nothing, as it can't without phantasm. Hence, after the body's destruction, there does not remain in the separated soul knowledge of things in the same way as it understands now. And this is where Aristotle finishes, knowing that the intellect is immortal, but uncertain of what that could mean. As it happens, the Catholic faith answers Aristotle's question. How then does the separated soul understand? By an infusion of information from things higher than itself. One example is your personal judgment upon death, in which a perfect knowledge of everything you've ever done will be given to you. On earth, infused knowledge is seen in out-of-body experiences, raptures from God, NDEs. The warning, the time spent between your death and the end of the world is made of infused knowledge. The young are a sort of font of this, Aquinas says, for toddlers and babies are withdrawn from preoccupations of their own bodies, and they receive information directly from their parents, namely by hearing and touch. When you die, you are then infused with knowledge, and through our active understanding, enter into a higher mode of understanding than what is possible on earth. Once time ends, we'll be given resurrected bodies with their new perfections. Then we will receive information from our senses, as is the intended nature of man, but we will also receive from God and the angels directly. It's been over 2,300 years since Aristotle lived, and our understanding of how the intellect operates is almost the same. We've shown that the intellect is its own act, and it subsists eternally in God forever. The Christian faith demonstrates how it will continue on after death and in the resurrected body. We see examples of raptures all throughout the Bible and in the lives of the saints. As St. Paul says, he was wrapped up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body he could not tell. And St. Thomas comments on this by quoting Exodus 33, which states, "No man shall see God and live." Yet Moses, Paul, John, and countless others have seen God and have had visions. Therefore, St. Paul's rapture was an out-of-body experience of infused knowledge. As we become a profoundly materialist society, God has confirmed the mysteries of the Catholic faith in multiple ways. Cosmology confirmed the Big Bang, which was hypothesized by a Jesuit priest who worked upon the Thomistic understanding of God. Studies on what one researcher has termed extra-dimensional objects like the Shroud of Turin and the tilma from Guadeloupe, and public miracles like that of Fatima all confound human knowledge. There is one area of new information that is relevant to the soul, that is the study of near-death experiences. Around the 1960s, CPR as a method of prolonging life was found out, and various other methods to resuscitate those who were already dead in their bodily sense. Near-death experiences and research about the brain help to demonstrate that Aristotle and Aquinas spoke correctly when they said that the intellect is immaterial, separated, and immortal. Near-death experiences are useless in their content, as they contradict each other like Protestantism, but they do show that the intellect remains in potency to sense even after the body is effectively dead. And in near-death experiences, we witness examples of knowledge infused in the intellect. One may ask why near-death experiences are not always Catholic in nature, and this is because the soul continues on earth, it is not judged, nor sent to its eternal life. In summary, near-death experiences do not accurately define heaven or hell, because they contradict each other, but they do suggest a degree of truth to the notion that the intellect is immaterial and separated. I say a degree of truth because all of these experiences rest on the testimony of the one who had the experience. But there is some legitimacy to it because there is repeated pattern observed over many subjects across numerous studies. Jeffrey Long, a radiation oncologist, started the Near-Death Experience Research Institute, which has accrued over 13,000 near-death experiences. They all share some similarities, including out-of-body experiences where the soul receives sense data despite being clinically dead. Many research institutes and studies have been done drawing attention from some of the greatest neuroscientists in the world. For instance, experimentation in Southampton General Hospital found that 11% that came back from heart attacks had NDEs. University of Virginia Hospital, Grayson, Pim van Lommel, and many others have studied these phenomena in clinical settings. Jeffrey Long published a study in the National Library of Medicine which states about 17% of those who die in a bodily manner and come back have had near-death experiences, including scientists, physicians, priests, politicians, religious, and atheists alike. The qualities of NDEs are such that 1. Organized experiences while unconscious, comatose, or clinically dead occur. 2. Seeing ongoing events from a location apart from the physical body while unconscious. 3. Vision in the blind and hearing in the deaf. Psychiatrist Brian Weiss tells the story of an elderly woman. He states, quote, "She suffered a cardiac arrest during her stay in the hospital where I, Weiss, was the chairman of the psychiatric department. She was unconscious as the resuscitation team tried to revive her. According to her later report, she floated out of her body and stood near the window, watching the resuscitation effort. She observed without any pain whatsoever as they thumped on her chest and pumped air into her lungs. During the resuscitation, a pen fell out of her doctor's pocket and rolled near the same window where her out-of-body experience was standing. The doctor eventually walked over and picked up the pen, put it back in the pocket, and then rejoined the effort to save her. They succeeded. A few days later, she told the doctor that she had observed the resuscitation team at work during the cardiac arrest. No, she was reassured. You were probably just hallucinating because of the lack of oxygen to the brain. This can happen when the heart stops beating. She said, but I saw your pen roll over to the window. She replied and then described other details of the resuscitation. The doctor was shocked. His patient had not only been comatose during the resuscitation, but she had been blind for years. For experiences that occur under general anesthetic, it should not be possible to have a lucid organized memory. Studies have shown EEG and brain imaging of patients under anesthesia, and thus the brain should not be able to produce lucid memories. After cardiac arrest, the EEG becomes flat within 10 to 20 seconds, and there is usually amnesia prior to and following the arrest. Here are a few testimonies. Quote, during my heart surgery, I felt myself lift from my body and go above the operating table. The doctor later told me that they had kept my heart open and stopped for a long time, and they had a great amount of difficulty getting my heart started again. That must have been when I left my body because I could see the doctors nervously trying to get my heart going. I was curious about what they were doing but not concerned. Then, as I drifted farther away, I saw my father at the head of the table. He looked up at me, which did give me a surprise, because he had been dead for almost a year. Dr. Jeffrey Long states in his medical journal that, in our collection of NDEs, 127 out of 600 NDA cases occurred under general anesthetic, and they included such features as out-of-body experience that involved experiencers watching the medical personnel working on their bodies, an unusually bright or vivid light meeting the deceased person, thoughts, memories, sensations, and so on. Number 5, some near-death experiences have a life review of their entire lives, which is quite similar to a man's final judgment. It is not possible to review all the events of your life when you're alive, let alone dead. In addition to near-death experiences, experiences of terminal lucidity are just as telling. Grayson from the University of Virginia wrote an abstract on terminal lucidity in medical literature. The examples that he cites include reports of brain abscesses, tumors, strokes, meningitis, dementia, and Alzheimer's. A second publication I'll refer to contains quantitative information on the prevalence of terminal lucidity, which was a recent inquiry into end-of-life experiences. Now, onto some case reports of terminal lucidity. Morse and Perry, 1990, reported a case of a 5-year-old boy who had been in a coma for 3 weeks, dying from a malignant brain tumor, during which he was almost constantly surrounded by various family members. Finally, on the advice of their minister, the family told the comatose child that they would miss him, but he had their permission to die. Suddenly and unexpectedly, the boy regained consciousness, thanked his family for letting him go, and told them he would be dying soon. He did in fact die the next day. Haig, in 2007, reported the case of a dying man of lung cancer that had spread to his brain. Toward the end of his life, a brain scan showed little brain tissue left, the metastasized tumors having not simply pushed aside normal brain tissue, but actually destroyed and replaced the brain tissue. In the days before his death, he lost all his ability to speak or move. According to a nurse and his wife, however, an hour before he died, he woke up and said goodbye to his family, speaking with them for 5 minutes before losing consciousness and dying again. This sort of experience is very telling, as the typical report from the materialist is that the brain releases chemicals which formulate these experiences. Though they do not explain by what form the brain knows to actuate chemical release before death, nevertheless, even if that were true, the brain in this case was seen by medical imaging to be utterly destroyed, making it theoretically impossible to deliver phantasms according to the normal mode. The report continues, in a case recently reported to us, a 42-year-old investment manager had a grand seizure out of the blue one night. Although his EEG showed generalized slowing, repeated MRIs appeared normal. 2 months later, however, a repeat MRI showed a plum-sized glioblastoma multiforme, the most aggressive form of brain cancer. 2 weeks after his surgery, the tumor had doubled in size, and a second had formed in his speech center. Following 2 surgical excisions, gamma knife radiation, chemotherapy, and steroids, he was able to get back to work part-time. However, the tumor soon recurred, and after a failed trial of an experimental oral chemotherapy agent, he declined further treatment and enrolled in hospice care at his home. He quickly became bedridden, blind in one eye, incontinent and increasingly incoherent in his speech and bizarre in his behavior. He appeared to be unable to make sense of his surroundings. After 7 weeks of that, he suddenly one night appeared calm and started speaking coherently, and then slept peacefully. The following morning he remained coherent and conversed with his wife, discussing his imminent death with her for the first time. However, he stopped speaking later that day and lay immobile in his bed, not eating or drinking for 2 more weeks, after which he expired after several hours of seizure. Noyes in 1952 described a 91-year-old woman who had suffered 2 strokes. The first stroke paralyzed the left side and deprived her of her speech. After a few months, the second stroke rendered her entirely paralyzed and speechless. A daughter cared for her, and on one occasion an exclamation from the woman caught the daughter's attention, and she saw the old woman smiling brightly, although her facial expression had been frozen since her second stroke. The woman turned her head and sat up in the bed with no apparent effort. She then raised her arms and exclaimed in a clear, joyous tone the name of her husband. Her arms dropped again and she sank back and died. She may have experienced a deathbed vision of her deceased husband, one doctor pontificated, but unquestionably regained her ability to use her body and speech during this experience, which was witnessed by the doctors present. To conclude, some of the cases presented, particularly those involving the destruction of brain tissue by cancer and Alzheimer's, pose difficulty for currently prevailing explanatory models of the brain, physiology, and mental functioning. At present, we think it is not possible to formulate definitive mechanisms for terminal lucidity, the report finishes. To wrap up, it is good to know these things, even to come to a perfect understanding of them, because they act as an external inducement towards God. Building the habit of understanding about the order and reason of God creates opportunity for God to move the will to assent to believe these things within his order. God creates order and he grants faith to those who take meritorious actions, creating opportunities for faith to logically grow. Thus, most people who do not believe in God do not understand the rationale for believing in God. Those who do and reject it, for instance Hume, show why reason alone is not enough, but a supernatural movement of the will to assent to matters of the faith is required, and this comes from God alone,